Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Blizzard recently made a very interesting post on the Legion Alpha forums. It was on the topic of secondary stat scaling throughout the expansion. So their first goal is to ensure that it doesn't feel bad at the start of an expansion due to having a low amount of a key stat. As an example, a fire mage with hardly any crit. And they also want it to be so that as you level up, it doesn't feel like your power is being nerfed, which actually, in terms of gameplay, does often happen. They also want to rein in on the numbers at max level so that you don't have just absolute crazy time when players have, like, say, high-end gear like Siege of Orgrimmar or Hellfire Citadel. So Celestalon gave the ballpark example that in Warlords of Draenor, your total damage multiplier at the start of the expansion due to secondary stats was about 1.58, and that by the end that had shot up to 3.11 for damage dealers and even more for healers, since Spirit and bonus armor are both super powerful. Also bear in mind that was only a 2-tier expansion, so that was a lot of shooting up within 2 tiers. In Legion, they want that multiplier due to secondary stats to start at, say, 1.78, so a bit higher, and end at 2.59, so a bit lower. To do this, they are going to reduce the scaling of per item level secondary stats on gear to be nearly linear past item level 800, but primary stats would scale as they normally do. So to make gameplay fun at the start of Legion, Dungeon gear is going to have comparatively far more secondary stats than, say, in Warlords of Draenor. So overall, what this system is meant to do is result in players being within the secondary stat range that equates to fun gameplay pretty much from the get-go, without reaching levels of absurdness that we see in, say, Hellfire Citadel or Siege of Orgrimmar, or at least reaching those levels of absurd amounts of stats at a far later point in time. So this changing in the balance between secondary and primary stat scaling means that, according to Celestalon, the point at which suboptimal secondary stat distribution is outweighed by increased primary stats would be a bit smaller than in Warlords of Draenor, perhaps by about 5 item levels. So this will have a very small impact on your moment-to-moment decision making, but it should have quite a large impact across the duration of the entire expansion. He also did mention that the removal of multi-strike meant that this whole damage sort of system was a lot less multiplicative, meaning that it's a bit easier for them to hit their goal of just all the stats kind of making sense in terms of the numbers. It was quite nice to see this post, honestly, though for reasons that I will get into, we kind of need to wait and see how this will play out. Many of us have talked about the problems with massive DPS growth within an expansion, especially how it creates a massive power imbalance between players, makes catch-up mechanics necessary to fix that imbalance, and then also creates barriers to entry for new players or alts. I would hope that these changes would go part of the way to reducing this problem overall. I also think the gameplay impacts of this are quite good. Often specs descend into oddness in terms of their gameplay when you have massive quantities of secondary stats, and equally, others are just not fun to play with a low amount of stats. A great example is probably the Fire Mage, perhaps the largest example of this. When you have a small critical hit chance, it is significantly less fun to play, which honestly just sucks. So moving back to the topic of all of this funky scaling as the expansion goes on, one persisting worry is what Blizzard might do with trinkets, procs, and legendary items. Trinkets have the potential to change how specs are played to a rather massive degree. Read up in the Unerring Vision of Lei Shen for a look at how crazy that can get. Anyway, in Siege of Orgrimmar and Hellfire Citadel, we have seen Blizzard implement some pretty bonkers items which, used right, lead to insane amounts of damage. Now, these trinkets are often experiments for future ideas and stats. For example, in Siege of Orgrimmar, a lot of those trinkets were turned into major design elements of Warlords of Draenor. I have to wonder if the Hellfire Citadel trinket situation with class trinkets will rear its head with Legion. Given how the legendary items are going to be class-based, I wouldn't be surprised if there was a bit of inspiration from the HFC trinkets. Now, that said, he did say that the main goal of what they're doing here is to preserve good quality gameplay, so this is not really a system that's overtly meant to manage number scaling, though, based on those multiplier numbers that Celestalon posted, it will help out with that a bit. So overall, this does seem like a great move to rein in secondary stats throughout the expansion's life, but I do have some lingering doubts about damage numbers bloating. If Legion is going to have 3 raid tiers, they'll really need to manage this problem deftly, because as a perfect example, if you were to look at the scaling in Warlords of Draenor, imagine if that had have continued on the same curve for another raid tier. It would have been mad. So perhaps the combination of all of these changes, perhaps some moderately sane trinkets and no legendary ring tomfoolery, will keep all of those issues at bay and emphasize fun gameplay. However, given how they seem to be designing trinkets and legendary world drops, I'm not 100% sold on that yet, so we're going to have to wait and see, but certainly this did bring up an interesting discussion topic in terms of the balance between primary stats, secondary stats, how that impacts decision making, and how it impacts the overall gameplay across the expansion's duration. So it was cool to see that post. I think it's a good move overall, and I suppose we'll just have to wait and see how it all plays out once we get into some raiding gear. Anyway, that's it for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.